She was forced by elite teachers to play the conservatory's most difficult piece amid laughter and mocking whispers. A professor sneered quietly. Did the bookstore girl walk into the wrong room? A student laughed aloud, La Campanella. She won't even make it to the last note. No one expected that those thin, trembling hands on the piano keys were about to make the entire hall rise in stunned silence and applause. Grace Miller stood just inside the grand recital hall, clutching her handwritten music notebook, her soft gray dress swaying slightly as she shifted her weight. Her old flats were scuffed, her light cardigan a little frayed at the cuffs, and her hair was pulled into a low bun. No makeup, just glasses that slipped down her nose. She was 28, with a quiet beauty that didn't demand attention, but the room noticed her anyway, and not kindly. The hall was a sea of polished wood and velvet seats filled with people who screamed wealth, designer suits, glittering jewelry, and the kind of confidence that came with privilege. Grace didn't belong not to them. The professors sat at a long table up front, their faces stern, their pens poised over notepads. The students, legacy kids and artist offspring, whispered behind manicured hands. A girl in a silk scarf giggled her eyes on Grace's notebook. Grace's fingers tightened on the pages, but her face stayed calm, like she was waiting for a bus, not facing an audition that could change her life. The air was thick with judgment, and Grace was already under fire. Hey, if this story's hitting you, grab your phone real quick. Hit that like button, drop a comment below, maybe share a time you were judged unfairly and subscribe to. Walk with us through stories of heartbreak and triumph. It means the world to keep this going. All right, let's get back to Grace. The whispers started before Grace even reached her seat. A student named Clara, all sharp cheekbones and a cashmere sweater, leaned toward her friend and muttered, "Who auditions for a conservatory dressed for the farmer's market?" Clara was a prodigy, or so she told everyone, her violin case monogrammed, her smile practiced. Her friend, a guy named Julian with slicked back hair and a Rolex, chuckled loud enough for Grace to hear. A handwritten score. Probably children's songs she made up, he said, his voice dripping with scorn. The professors didn't stop them. One, a woman named Dr. Hargrove with a severe bun and pearl earrings, glanced at Grace's flats and frowned, scribbling something on her notepad. Grace set her notebook on the chair beside her, her movements slow, deliberate, like she was drawing a line in the sand. The room kept buzzing, the laughter sharp, like kids picking on the new girl at school. "Bet she'll flub the first note and cry," Clara said, her voice carrying. Grace's hand paused on her notebook, but her face didn't change. The audition began with a basic skills check, and the cruelty got bolder. A professor named Mr. Long, a wiry man with the goatee and a reputation for breaking students, called Grace to the piano first. "Let's see what the bookstore girl can do," he said, his voice cold, his eyes narrow. The room tittered, phones slipping out to film. Grace walked to the piano, her flats quiet on the polished floor, her cardigan brushing her wrists. She sat, adjusted her glasses, and played a series of jazz chords, clean, rich, each note ringing like a bell. The room blinked, the laughter dying for a moment. Julian's Rolex glinted as he leaned forward, his smirk gone. "Doctor." Hargrove's pen stopped moving, her lips parting slightly. Grace finished, her hands resting on the keys, her face calm. "Lucky guess, Mr. Lang muttered, waving her back to her seat. The room relaxed, the whispers starting again, but there was a new edge now, like they weren't so sure. The mockery didn't let up. A student named Vanessa, a pianist with long nails and a designer dress, stood up during a break, her voice loud. "Did you practice on a toy keyboard at that bookstore?" She said, her laugh sharp, her eyes on Grace. Vanessa was all about her image, always posting rehearsal videos online, her followers eating up her charm. The room laughed, some clapping their phones, flashing. Grace was adjusting her notebook, her fingers pausing on a page, a faint crease between her brows. She looked at Vanessa, her gaze steady. "Did you?" she said, her voice soft but clear, like a pebble dropped in a pond. Vanessa's laugh caught her nails, tapping her phone nervously. The room kept going, but a few students shifted their smiles uneasy. Grace went back to her notebook, her hands steady, but her glasses slipped again, and she pushed them up, a small gesture that felt like defiance. The humiliation turned uglier when a professor named Dr. Patel, a man with a booming voice and a taste for Rolexes, decided to make an example of Grace. He stood, his suit crisp, and pointed at her. "If you're confident, try Liszt's La Campanella now," he said, his smirk wide, his voice carrying to the back of the hall. The room gasped, then laughed. Clara clapped her hands, her cashmere sweater slipping off one shoulder. I spent 2 years mastering that one, she said, her voice gleeful. Doctor. Hargrove leaned forward, her pearls gleaming, and added, If you can't please step aside, we don't have time to waste. Grace's hands trembled slightly as she stood, her notebook left on the chair, her flats clicking softly. She sat at the piano, the room buzzing phones out, ready for a crash. She took a breath, her fingers hovering, then launched into La Campanella, blistering precise, each note a firework. The room fell silent, mouths open, phones shaking. Grace's hands danced, her control stunning, her expression raw. Clara's hands froze her sweater, forgotten. The final note rang out, and the silence was heavy, broken only by a student's whispered, No way. The professors weren't done. Doctor. Hargrove stood, her face tight, her voice sharp. That could be a fluke, she said, her pen tapping her notepad. Try Chopin's Winter Wind. Let's see if you're real. The room erupted in whispers, heads turning, phones still filming. Now she'll expose herself, Julian muttered, his Rolex catching the light. An older professor, Mr. Stein, with white hair and a permanent frown, leaned forward. Whose student are you? Where are your certificates? He said, his voice low, suspicious. Grace's fingers brushed her cardigan, her glasses slipping again. She pushed them up, her face calm but her jaw tight. I'm my own student, she said, her voice soft like a challenge. The room laughed, but it was nervous now, the air thick with doubt. Grace sat at the piano, her hands steadying, and began Winter Wind. The notes roared, a whirlwind of brilliance, each phrase dripping with emotion. Mr. Stein's eyes widened, his frown gone. Doctor. Patel's Rolex stopped ticking as he leaned forward, his smirk gone. The room was a graveyard of stunned faces, and Grace was the only one alive. The cruelty took a new turn during a break when Vanessa decided to up the ante. She walked over to Grace's chair, her designer dress swishing, and picked up Grace's notebook, flipping through it like it was trash. What's this, your diary? She said, holding up a page of handwritten music, her voice loud enough for the hall. The room laughed, some crowding around, phones out. Vanessa waved, the notebook pages fluttering. Look, she's got doodles, she said, pointing to a margin sketch of a piano key. Grace stood, her flats quiet, and reached for the notebook. That's mine, she said, her voice low, steady. Vanessa smirked, holding it higher. Come on, bookstore girl, share your masterpiece, she said, tossing it to Julian. Grace's hand twitched, but she stayed still, her eyes locked on Vanessa. You done playing? She said, her words soft but heavy. Vanessa's smirk faltered, and she dropped the notebook, the pages scattering. Grace knelt, gathering them, her hands careful, her silence louder than their laughter. The mockery got personal when a student named Ethan, a composer with a man bun and a superiority complex, decided to lecture Grace. Ethan was all about his genius, always talking about his avant-garde pieces, his ego bigger than the hall. He stood during a discussion, pointing at Grace. You probably don't even know what a fugue is, he said, his voice loud, his hands waving. Stick to your bookstore tunes. The room chuckled, some clapping, their phones flashing. Grace was adjusting her cardigan, her fingers pausing on a loose thread. She looked at Ethan, her gaze steady, her glasses catching the light. Play one. Then she said, her voice soft but sharp like a needle. Ethan's hands froze, his man bun bobbing as he stammered. The room laughed, but it was at him now, his ego deflating. Grace went back to her notebook, her hands steady, but her shoulders were tense like she was bracing for the next hit. The humiliation hit a new low when Dr. Patel decided to test Grace's ear. He stood, his Rolex glinting, and played a complex chord on the piano, his voice smug. Name it, he said, his eyes on Grace, the room watching. Or are you just good at memorizing? The room tittered, phones out, ready for her to fail. Grace stood, her flats clicking, and walked to the piano. She played the chord back note for note, then named it D-flat diminished seventh. The room gasped, but Dr. Patel wasn't done. He played another, then another, each more obscure. Grace named them all, her voice calm, her hands steady on the keys. Enough, she said finally, her eyes meeting his, her voice soft but firm. Doctor. Patel's smirk vanished, his Rolex forgotten. The room was quiet, but the whispers started again, sharper now, like they were scared. The cruelty turned vicious when a student named Sophia, a vocalist with a sleek bob and a cruel streak, decided to mock Grace's appearance during a group critique. Sophia was all about her stage presence, always posing for photos, her voice dripping with charm. She stood, her heels clicking, and gestured at Grace's cardigan. Is that your audition outfit or your grandmother's hand-me-down? She said, her voice loud, her smile sharp. The room roared, some clapping phones flashing. Sophia kept going, pointing at Grace's flats. Did you walk here from the thrift store? Grace's fingers tightened on her notebook, her glasses slipping, but her face stayed calm. She stood smoothing her cardigan and looked at Sophia. Does your voice match your heart? She said, her voice soft but piercing. Sophia's smile froze, her heels wobbling slightly, but the room kept laughing their mockery, a wave crashing over Grace's quiet strength. The bullying escalated when a professor named Dr. Carver, a composer with a bald head and a sharp tongue, decided to challenge Grace's originality. He stood holding a score from Grace's notebook that Vanessa had left scattered and waved it. This looks like a cheap imitation of Debussy, he said, his voice booming, his eyes on Grace. Did you copy this from a library book? The room gasped, then laughed, phones out filming. Grace's hand twitched, but she stayed seated, her notebook in her lap, her glasses catching the light. She stood walking to Dr. Carver and took the score, her fingers steady. Play it, she said, her voice low like a dare. Dr. Carver scoffed, but sat at the piano, stumbling through the piece, his hands clumsy. Grace's score was complex, original, alive. The room went quiet, Dr. Carver's face red. It's mine, Grace said, her voice soft but final, taking the score back. The laughter died, but the sting lingered, the room's cruelty sharper now. The mockery reached a new peak when a group of students led by Julian decided to recreate Grace's audition for laughs. Julian, with his Rolex and slicked-back hair, stood during a break mimicking Grace's walk to the piano, his steps exaggerated, his hands clutching a fake notebook. Oh, look, I'm the bookstore girl, he said, his voice high, his friends laughing. They took turns, each one playing a few clumsy notes, flopping dramatically on the bench, their phones filming. La Campanella. More like La Disaster. Clara shouted, her cashmere sweater slipping. Grace was retying her flats, her fingers pausing, her jaw tight. She stood her notebook under her arm and looked at Julian. You're wasting your own time, she said, her voice soft but heavy, like a stone dropped in water. Julian's laugh caught his Rolex glinting as he sat, but the room kept going, their parody a cruel mirror of Grace's truth. The humiliation turned coordinated when Vanessa organized a vote during a discussion. She stood her designer dress shimmering and held up her phone, her voice loud. Let's see who thinks the bookstore girl belongs here, she said, her nails tapping the screen. Thumbs up for no. The room laughed, hands shooting up, phones flashing as they filmed. Vanessa counted, her voice gleeful. Wow, unanimous, she said, turning to Grace. Guess you're out. Grace's fingers curled around her notebook, her glasses slipping, but her face stayed calm. She stood smoothing her dress and looked at Vanessa. Your vote doesn't play the keys, she said, her voice soft but clear, like a bell in fog. Vanessa's nails stopped tapping, her smile wavering, but the room kept laughing, their thumbs a wall of rejection around Grace. The final blow came when Mr. Lang decided to test Grace's endurance. He stood, his goatee twitching, and announced a new challenge. Play Beethoven's Hammerklavier Sonata, first movement now. The room gasped, whispers flying. That's insane, Ethan muttered, his man bun bobbing. Mr. Lang smirked, his eyes on Grace. If you can't, you're wasting our time. Grace's hands trembled as she stood, her cardigan swaying, her flats clicking. She sat at the piano, her glasses slipping, and took a breath. The room was buzzing, phones out, ready for failure. Grace began, her hands steady, the notes thundering, each phrase a battle. The room went quiet, Mr. Lang's smirk gone, his goatee still. Grace's fingers flew, her expression raw, her music a force. The final note echoed and the room was silent, phones, forgotten faces, pale. Grace stood, her hands steady, her silence louder than their cruelty. The class moved to a group exercise and the cruelty turned coordinated. Clara, the prodigy, organized a mock recital pairing students to perform short pieces. She put Grace with Ethan, smirking as she announced it. Let's see what the bookstore girl can do with a real composer, she said, her cashmere sweater slipping again. The room laughed, phones out filming. Ethan handed Grace a scribbled score, his handwriting messy, his voice mocking. Try not to butcher it, he said. Grace took the score, her fingers brushing the paper, her glasses slipping. She sat at the piano, her hands hovering, and played clean, expressive, turning Ethan's mess into music. The room went quiet, Ethan's man bun bobbing as he stared, his ego crumbling. That's not what I wrote, he muttered, but nobody listened. Grace stood her flats quiet and set the score down, her eyes on Clara. Next, she said, her voice soft but heavy. Clara's sweater slipped further, her smirk gone. The audition was winding down, but the professors weren't satisfied. Mr. Lang stood, his goatee twitching, and called Grace back to the piano. One more, he said, his voice cold. Rachmaninoff's Concerto. No. 3 first movement. If you can't, you're out. The room gasped, whispers flying. Nobody plays that unprepared, Julian muttered, his Rolex glinting. Vanessa laughed, her nails tapping her phone. Grace's hands trembled as she stood, her notebook left behind her cardigan brushing her wrists. She sat, her glasses slipping, and took a breath. The first notes rang out bold, precise, each phrase a story of pain and triumph. The room was silent, phones, forgotten faces, pale. Mr. Stein, the older professor, wiped his eyes, his frown gone. Dr. Hargrove's pen fell rolling off the table. Grace's hands flew, her expression raw, her music a force that filled the hall. The final chord echoed and the room erupted in applause, professors standing, students frozen. The head judge, a woman named Dr. Ellison, with silver hair and a kind face, stood, her voice shaky. We were wrong to judge you by appearance, she said, walking to the stage, her heels clicking. The conservatory is honored to accept an artist like you. She bowed slightly, her eyes wet, the room still clapping. Grace stood, her flats quiet, her cardigan swaying. She nodded, her face calm, her glasses slipping again. Thank you, she said, her voice soft like a whisper that carried. The room was alive, the air thick with awe. Clara's cashmere sweater was crumpled, her prodigy status forgotten. Julian's Rolex was still, his smirk gone. Vanessa's phone was dark, her nails silent. Grace's notebook lay on her chair, its pages worn but powerful like her. The silence broke when a young student named Anna, a timid girl with braids and a worn backpack, stood from the back of the hall. Anna had been quiet all day, her eyes wide, her hands clutching a music folder. She walked to Grace, her steps shaky, and held out a small folded note. I saw you play, she said, her voice trembling. It gave me courage to audition. The crowd watched, some whispering, others nodding. Grace took the note, her fingers careful, and opened it, a child's drawing of a piano with thank you scrawled in crayon. Grace's lips parted, her glasses slipping, and she nodded, her eyes bright. Keep playing, she said, her voice soft but warm like a hug. Anna smiled, her braids bouncing, and stepped back, her folder clutched tight. The room felt warmer now, the truth of Grace's impact spreading like light. A professor named Dr. When a quiet man who'd stayed silent all day stood and walked to the piano, his hands clasped. Dr. Ween was older, his glasses thick, his reputation built on spotting rare talent. He picked up Grace's notebook left on the chair and flipped through it, his eyes scanning the handwritten scores. These are original, he said, his voice low but clear, holding up a page. This is genius. The room gasped, some leaning forward, others looking down. Dr. Ween turned to Grace, his face soft. You've been teaching yourself this, he asked. Grace nodded, her cardigan swaying, her flat still. Since I was 10, she said, her voice soft but steady. The room was silent. Dr. Ween's words sinking in the truth of Grace's talent, a weight nobody could lift. The tension shattered when a phone pinged loud and sharp from the crowd. It was Vanessa's, and she fumbled to silence it, her face pale. The screen lit up with a notification, a news alert, the headline flashing. Conservatory shamed viral video exposes bullying of unknown genius. The article quoted Julian's parody, Sophia's outfit jab, Vanessa's notebook stunt, all now trending with millions of views. The crowd gasped, some pulling out their phones, scrolling frantically. Clara's hands shook as she saw her name in the comments, her recital deal crumbling. Ethan's face went white, his festival rejection already public. Grace didn't look at the phones. She adjusted her notebook, her steps steady, her face calm. Dr. Ellison caught her eye, nodding slightly like they shared a secret. The room was unraveling, but Grace stood tall, her silence a force of its own. Dr. Hargrove, her pearls still gleaming, stood and walked to the stage, her notepad left behind. She'd been harsh all day, her pen a weapon, but now her face was soft, her voice low. I've taught here for 30 years, she said, her eyes on Grace. I've never seen a soul play like you. She held out a letter, a full-ride scholarship signed by the board. The crowd murmured, some clapping, others looking down. Grace took the letter, her fingers brushing the paper, her glasses slipping again. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but clear like a note that lingers. "Doctor." Hargrove nodded, her pearls catching the light, and stepped back, her face wet. The room was alive, the truth of Grace's triumph, a melody that filled the hall, her presence, a light nobody could dim. The final moment came when a janitor named Mr. Harris, a quiet man who'd watched from the wings, stepped forward. Mr. Harris was older, his uniform worn, his hands rough from years of work. He held a small, battered cassette tape, his voice low. "I heard you practicing in the bookstore," he said, his eyes on Grace. "Taped it for my daughter." He handed her the tape, his hands shaking. "You're why she wants to play." Grace took the tape, her fingers careful, her eyes bright. "Tell her to keep going," she said, her voice soft, but heavy, like a vow. "Mr. Harris nodded, his uniform creasing, and stepped back, his face proud. The room watched, some in awe, some in shame, as Grace tucked the tape into her notebook, her presence filling the hall, her truth, a song that echoed beyond the walls. The fallout was quiet but real. Vanessa's rehearsal videos tanked, her followers dropping after her notebook stunt went viral, labeled bullying online. Clara's violin recital lost its sponsor, her Prodigy label now a joke after clips of her mocking Grace spread. Ethan's avant-garde piece was rejected by a festival, his genius questioned after his score was outshined by Grace. Dr. Patel's masterclass was cancelled, his reputation dented by posts about his unfair chord test. Julian's music blog lost traction, his comments about Grace's children's songs now a public embarrassment. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just reality catching up like a note that lingers after the music stops. Grace didn't comment on any of it. She didn't need to. Her silence was enough. Grace didn't keep the spotlight. A week later, she was back at the bookstore shelving novels, her gray dress swapped for a sweater and jeans. A customer, an older woman with a cane, recognized her from a viral video of the audition. "You're that pianist," she said, her voice warm. Grace smiled, her glasses slipping, and nodded. "Just Grace," she said, stacking a book. The woman touched her arm, her eyes bright. "You gave me hope," she said. Grace paused, her hands still, and nodded again, her smile small but real. The bookstore was quiet, the shelves tall, but it was home. She'd played there too in her own way every day. The Conservatory gave Grace a full-ride scholarship, invitations to international recitals, and requests for private lessons from professors who'd once dismissed her. She accepted the scholarship but turned down the lessons, her voice soft but firm. "I've got my own way," she said, her notebook under her arm. She started teaching free piano classes at a community center. Her students a mix of kids and retirees, their hands clumsy but eager. One girl, a shy 12-year-old named Lily, played a simple scale, her fingers shaking. Grace knelt beside her, adjusting her hands. "You're enough," she said, her voice low like a secret. Lily smiled, her scales stronger now. The room was small, the piano old, but it was alive, built from Grace's truth. The story spread not because Grace pushed it, but because people needed it. Older folks, the ones who'd been judged their whole lives, saw her and felt seen. The ones who'd been called too plain, too quiet, too small, they got it. They'd been in halls like that, surrounded by sneers, judged for their clothes, their jobs, their dreams. They'd kept going too, just like Grace. Her story wasn't about the applause, though, that's what the videos showed. It was about the bookstore shifts, the frayed cardigan, the kids she taught for free. It was about standing up when the world bets you'll fall. Grace didn't know how many shared her story, how many felt stronger because of it. She was too busy shelving books, playing scales, living her truth. Some nights, Grace would pause at the community center, her notebook open, the kids gone home. She'd look at the drawings they'd taped to the wall, messy sketches of piano's notes, and her always smiling. She'd played for them, for herself, for the ones who'd never get a stage. The world had tried to break her, but it didn't. She wasn't wrong to stay quiet, to let her music talk. She wasn't alone in her fight, not anymore. And now she was building something new, one note at a time. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and hit follow to walk with me through heartbreak, betrayal, and finally healing.